Hello students, in a very short I am going to speak summary of Pride and Prejudice. First let me discuss characters. This is the statement universally known and you should always remember when you deal with question related Pride and Prejudice, and this opening line of this novel. It is a truth universally acknowledge that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So that is actually a very famous line of Pride and Prejudice. So please start with this line. You can start with this line. It sets the tone of the novel, right? Now here are six families and one very important family, Bennet family, where husband, wife, and five daughters are there. Jane, Elizabeth, which is also known as her name is Elizabeth, and Lizzie is also famous, and then Mary, Catherine, Kitty, also another name is Kitty, and Lydia. These are the five sisters. And then next family is Darcy family, where uh, Mr. William Darcy or Fitzwilliam Darcy is important, and then her sister Georgiana and Colonel Fitzwilliam, and then Bingley family here. Charles Bingley is very important, and then Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hertz. These are the two sisters of Charles Bingley, very haughty and rudely. Fourth family, Lucas family. Here, Charlotte Lucas is important. Mr. and Mrs. daughter Charlotte Lucas is very important, and her younger sister Maria Lucas, but Charlotte is important. Then Gardiner family, where husband, wife, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gardner. Mr. Gardner is sister, brother of Mrs. Bennet, right? And last family is Deberg, Lady Deberg, and Mrs. Deberg, that is mother, and daughter is Miss Deberg. So these are the six families. Other important characters here: Mr. Collins and Mr. Wickham, and then Mrs. Phillips and Colonel Foster, Mrs. Foster. Today I am not going to discuss much, I am just telling you the story. What's the story? First, we have to remember that's the story. There are some places are there, so I am going to write in next video. That is, a place is London, and that's a Longbourn is the place which is nearby London, and where there is a all activities like actions will take place in the Longbourn, and another place nearby Longbourn, uh, that is not. Hey, wait a minute. Another place is that Netherfield Park, and then a story starts. So what happened then? First of all, as the novel opens, that Mrs. Bingley comes to know that in their nearby village there is a Netherfield Park, and where Mr. Bingley and other friends they have come, and Mr. Bingley come for living. And then as Mrs. Bennet comes to know, and she's very much obsessed that she actually wants to see her daughters happy, and if they are not much happy with the husband, but then anyhow they should settle, and then they should get married with a rich person. And as she comes to know that Mr. Bingley, as a neighbor, he has come here and he's a handsome fellow. So as Mrs. Bennet is very raw, and she forces her husband to go to visit Mr. Bingley, uh, and then Mr. Bingley. So Mr. Bennet has to go, and as Mr. Bennet meets to Mr. Bingley, and Mr. Bingley is very soft and very a good person, and he shows his library to Mr. Bingley, to Mr. Bennet. Or this way, Mr. Bennet meets to Mr. Bingley, and then Mr. Bingley is really a very handsome and good natured person. Then one day there is ball dance in their community or friend like club, so where all number of people meet in that ball dance. So that is when in the evening when it is started, so Mr. Bingley meets Jane, first daughter of Bennet family, senior daughter, and then he gets attracted. He is smitten to see Jane, who Charles Bingley, and then they start dancing together, and for long time they dance, and one all of a sudden Mr. Bingley sees that Darcy is standing alone, walking here and there. So he comes to Darcy, and who is Darcy? Darcy is Mr. Bingley's close friend, right? William Darcy. So he says, who Charles Bingley says to Mr. Darcy that why don't you dance? There is a daughter, Jane's sister is sitting, Elizabeth. And then as he says that, and Elizabeth is sitting somewhere, and she listens that Darcy says that no, 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 they don't come from, they come from, like, I don't want to mingle up with middle class people, they are middle class. And that's a that comment is very negative comment, and Elijah listens their conversation, and she decides not to talk to this person. Then later he came and he says that we can get dance together, but then she says no, she refuses. And then 5 6 times there are party, but then she says that sorry, because that's a mm, uh, actually very negative remark is that's a bouillon, and the bouillon means middle class people who are not very much poor, but not very rich and have a very fixed mindset, and that is very negative comment, and that's the onward she dislikes Darcy. And then 5 6 party she always avoid Darcy, who Elizabeth avoids Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Now day by day, and then one day, Mr. Bingley's two sisters, that is one is Caroline and second one is Mrs. Hurd, and both are very arrogant, and they invite Jane for dinner. So as Jane goes there and she becomes ill because she is wet in the rain, and there's a downpour on the way and she gets wet, and that's why she has to stay in that's a Netherfield Park for some time, in fact for long time. And that is why as Elizabeth comes to know, so she wants to take care of her sister, so she goes. And as she goes on to Netherfield Park, so that's her dress in mud, like her dress is uh, uh, that's a there is a mud in her dress, and that's why she's not able to wash it properly as she reaches. And Miss Caroline and Mrs. Hertz, they criticize Elizabeth, but she does not bother because she has to take care of her sister. So she goes upstairs, and they all other members are sitting in the hall. And then Miss Caroline and Hertz tells to Darcy, see, she does not have cutsies, and she's not sitting among us. Instead, she's sitting with her sister upstairs, but she's taking care of Jane. And then after some time when Jane recovers, so then Elizabeth and Jane, they come back to home. As they come they come to know that Mr. Collins has come, and Mr. Collins is Mr. Bennet's cousin, and he has come for marriage purpose, because he thinks that any girl girls of 5 may be a good alliance for him. But then um, Jane is already engaged now with Jane is engaged with Charles Bingley, so that Mrs. Mrs. Bennet provokes Elizabeth to get married with Mr. Collins, but then Mr. Collins is not in favor. He does not like Mr. Collins, and then Elizabeth refuse, and she refused this proposal, and she this way she makes happy her father, and annoy her mother, because mother wants to see see one of the daughters with Mr. Collins, so that another daughter also will be settled. But then as Elizabeth refuses, mother gets annoyed. Anyway, after some time it's normal, and then everything, like life is smooth. But after that, then Jane and Charles Bingley, they used to meet. But one day one letter comes to Bingley's sister, so Bennet's sister, that Mr. Bingley, that's a Caroline, writes to Jane that we are leaving here from here, and now we will never come back. So, as Elizabeth comes to know about this news, she becomes disheartened, because she thinks that my sister Jane loves to Mr. Caroline, but now they are going to London and they will never come back. So she is very much both the sisters are disappointed, and then Mrs. Gardiner invites Miss Jane to their home, so that and she says that come with live with us for some time, so your disappointment will be removed. But okay, Jane and Elizabeth go to Mr. Gardiner, Mrs. Gardiner. As they go there, then Mrs. Gardiner takes she takes them to different places, so then for entertainment. One day she reaches to the they all Mr. Mrs. Gardner. So they meet that they meet no in yes in the meanwhile, what happened, that Elizabeth visits to Collins. I forgot to tell you where is Collins. Mr. Collins, as he comes to know that he is refused by each daughter of Bennet family, so that there is Miss Charlotte. She is a good friend, very close friend of Miss Elizabeth. So they Elizabeth and Charlotte, they are very good friends. So then Mr. Collins moves to Charlotte and proposes her for marriage, and Charlotte becomes agree, because reason is that Charlotte is marriageable girl, and she thinks that I'm getting late, and though she does not wants to have much love, rather she wants to be secured, and that's why she is ready. And then she gets married with Mr. Collins, and now they are living happily in London. So as now Elizabeth and Miss Jane move to their uncle, Mr. Gardiner, Mrs. Gardiner. Then Mrs. Gardiner uh, takes Jane here and there for entertaining her, so that her mood will be recovered. And in the meanwhile, Miss Elizabeth uh, visits to Charlotte. Now Charlotte is wife of Mr. Colin, and then they are living happily. So as she moves, and then meets, then where they meet Mrs. Lady Catherine. And who is Lady Catherine? I have already. She is the cousin. She is the caretaker of Mr. Collins. and the relative of Mr. Collins, and then Darcy, Mr. Darcy also. And then as Elizabeth meets, and Lady Catherine not like much Elizabeth, because she comes to know that uh, Elizabeth is somewhat is interested in Mr. Darcy, and they reach to the uh, Pimberley, where uh, Elizabeth sees that Mr. Darcy. No, sorry, Mr. Darcy also visit to Colin's home, and then they meet, and in the meanwhile, she comes to know who Elizabeth comes to know that Mr. Darcy is very arrogant person. In the beginning, she notices, and then where here, sorry, I would forget to tell you. Here she meets Mr. Wickham, and Mr. Wickham is army officer, and Mr. Wickham tells to Elizabeth about Darcy, that Darcy's father wants to give my father a part of property and something, and Darcy's father was very much interested to support us, but Darcy denies, and this way he does backbiting. He speaks something against of Mr. Darcy to Elizabeth. So Elizabeth thinks that Mr. Darcy is very arrogant and very cunning fellow, and now he is not helping out to Mr. Wickham, and she thinks that second reason to dislike Mr. Darcy. Then Elizabeth thinks that thanks God that she is not associated with Mr. Darcy, because he is arrogant, not only arrogant but very good, very cunning fellow also. And then it happens after some time, Jane and Elizabeth come back to home, and as they are sitting, and no, they are just with Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. But then through one letter, they come to know that their sister Lydia, youngest one, she is eloped with Mr. Wickham, and then that's a problem, a very big issue, because of sisters reputation and Bennett family reputation, where five sisters are unmarried, and what happened if Lydia will do like this. So that they search in London, whole London, along with Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. They search Lydia and Mr. Wickham. And then one day, Elizabeth comes to know that Mr. Wickham is demanding for huge money. And then he said that this is a condition, then we are going to get married. Otherwise, Lydia will be single. I don't get married with Lydia, though they have already eloped. But then after some time, Elizabeth comes to know that they are getting married, and because that the money who he was demanding, what he was demanding is fulfilled. So she thinks that that is done by Mr. Gardiner. But later she comes to know that that payment or that money is given by Mr. Darcy. Then her mindset changes, that no, she gets impressed that he saved our reputation, and now Lydia would be happy, and she is happy. And then she is somewhat, then here Lady Catherine warns Miss Elizabeth that not to get married, because Lady Catherine wants to get Mr. Darcy and her own daughter's marriage. But Mr. Darcy is not interested, because he is much interested to get married with Miss Elizabeth. Then finally, as Elizabeth comes to know that this a huge money is paid by Mr. Darcy, and then she's in love with Mr. Darcy. And uh, yes, one more complaint one day she does with Mr. Darcy, that you were the only person who agitated Mr. Charles Bingley to leave London and then not to get married, because you and Darcy, sorry, you and yeah, she thinks that Elizabeth thinks that Mr. Darcy and uh, uh, Miss Caroline, they have designed the plot against Jane's love, and that's why my sister is aloof from Mr. Caroline, Mr. Bingley, because of your suggestion, and you left that place, Netherfield Park, and you shifted to London. But later, we as through text we come to know that Miss Caroline was also interested to get married with Mr. Darcy, but Darcy is inclined to, now he is very much interested for Elizabeth. But finally, happy ending is that Jane and Bingley meet and they get married. They get married, and here Lydia is first marriage, Lydia and Wickham, and then Jane and Mr. Bingley, they have got married, and finally this is also this also become couple, that Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy and Miss Elizabeth, they have got married, and they all are settled here and there nearby London and happily living. Thank you so much. God bless you.